today. Welcome to the Graduate Student Committee Digital Humanities Showcase. My name is Rita O'Meara, and I want to go ahead and apologize if I sound a little wheezy. I'm recovering from a cough, so please forgive if I sound a little off. So as I said, welcome to the Graduate Student Committee Digital Humanities Showcase. Thank you so much for taking time today to join us. And thank you so much ahead of time to all of our speakers for sharing all of their research with us. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. My name is Rita O'Meara, and I am the chair of the GSC this year. We're really excited to be hosting this event for the first time and are really looking forward to hearing the presentations and learning more about the digital humanities and other technical innovations in the study of the Middle Ages. Before we get started, I wanted to give a little bit of information on the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy of America, the work we do, and how you can become a part of our team. The GSC is made up of 6 graduate students from various disciplines who work together to offer a series of services to our global medievalist graduate student community. We have a triennial newsletter that is sent to members of the Medieval Academy, as well as a mentoring program that is linked to 3 of the major medieval conferences, including Kalamazoo, IMC Leeds, and the MAA annual meeting. The mentoring programs pair graduate students and early career scholars with established faculty or professionals who serve as their mentors throughout the conference and, we hope, beyond. We also began a podcast series last year called The Multicultural Middle Ages, which I welcome you to check out. Our second season will launch this February. Lastly, we are really active on social media, especially on Twitter and Facebook. I will be sharing our social media handles throughout the day today, and please consider giving us a follow or sending us a message. From conference panels to professionalization webinars to showcases like today's, the GSC also carries out other initiatives and programs for the medievalist graduate community. Many of our previous webinars can be found on the MAA's YouTube page. If you are interested in joining the GSC, please check out the MAA's website for more information or follow to the link on the screen. Self-nominations to join the GSC are due 15 January. We are currently looking to fill 3 spots with 2-year terms. If you have any questions about the GSC, please feel free to reach out to us at gsc@themedievalacademy.org or email me at rao44@case.edu. Without further ado, I would now like to turn to the event at hand, the Digital Humanities Showcase. We will have 3 sessions today with 2 10-minute breaks between, and then we will finish out the day with a special presentation by Professor Roger Martínez-Dávila, discussing his work on the Immersive Global Middle Ages project. We hope you will be able to join us for the whole day, but feel free to also pop in and out as you would like. The full conference schedule is available online, and I will share the link momentarily. Today's showcase is meant to serve as a forum for scholars to gather and learn about, as well as celebrate achievements and work in the digital humanities broadly conceived. Above all, the Digital Humanities Showcase is meant to be fun and exciting, giving participants and presenters alike the chance to share ideas and connect. With this in mind, we have allocated plenty of time for questions at the end of each session. Lastly, I would like to give a huge thanks to the Medieval Academy for helping make this event possible, especially the Executive Director, Lisa Fagan-Davis, and the Communications and Membership Coordinator, Chris Cole. Additional thanks go to the current Medieval Academy President, Marie Miller, and Elizabeth Lastra of the MAA's Digital Humanities and Multimedia Studies Committee. Dr. Lastra will be giving a few words today at 12:20 p.m., so we hope you can join us for that. Lastly, I would like to give a huge shout out to first-year GSC members Maggie Heeshen, Maria Thomas, and Will Beatty, who helped plan today's event and who are serving as session chairs. With that settled, I will now turn the virtual stage to Maggie, who will lead our first session starting at 11:10 a.m. Eastern. Thank you.
So welcome to our first session. This is Text as Data. I'm your chairperson. I'm Maggie Heeshen. I'm a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And our first speaker today is going to be Zhishang King. Zhishang King is a PhD candidate focusing on late antiquity in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. His doctoral project involves identifying the political and economic circumstances behind amplified rhetoric within unabridged late Roman and post-Roman laws, in particular the post-Theodosian novels. His other long-term interests include classical and post-classical Sino-Roman comparative history. In his previous life, he worked as a photo editor for the Reuters news agency. Take it away, Zhishang.
Hi, everyone. I also want to mention I too have a cough, so I'm extremely thankful for this remote format. So let's just get the slideshow started. So, being the first to go, there's always a small bit of anxiety because you're not quite sure how the rest will pan out. But since I'm setting the tone, I just want to open with a few caveats. Even though I'm a historical researcher, I'm also a failed computer science major. I say this because I'm definitely not an expert in a lot of these technologies, but obviously having some background helps. So for those who are already experts, I'd like to think I'm learning quickly and I'm making great strides. But for those who are completely new and might feel daunted, I learned a lot of this over the past year while partly on parental leave, taking care of a newborn baby. So if I can do it, you can as well. So I work on late Roman and post-Roman unabridged laws, particularly the post-Theodosian novels. And, a lot of times when we think of laws, we generally think of them as statutes. That's sort of what we have in mind with the legal codes deriving from Roman law. So generally, they're kind of written with a sense of neutrality from the issuer to the specific circumstance being addressed. But what do we do with laws that seem to have a heightened amount of emotionality within them? Part of my research is trying to tease out if there are political motivations behind such emotion. However, in order to do this, I need to figure out how I might measure this emotionality, not just theoretically, but practically. So I'm just going to skip the theoretical aspect of measuring, emotionality, although I do have a particular methodology based upon modern sentiment analysis. Instead, I'm just going to talk about the practical aspect of how to do so with primary source texts, because once we move from the specifics of my historical subject, how one tries to do such research is actually generally common in practice. I mean, for a lot of us, we kind of do our work on, Microsoft Word or PDF. We tend to highlight certain entries of interest, and this is how I got, my start. Maybe you organize your highlights or color coding into a spreadsheet, but this is kind of limited to a degree because you can't search particular highlights. It's a visual reference only. Alternatively, you could have a proprietary program like, say, NVivo, which now you can actually attach unique identifiers to your highlights, things called codes. They can be sorted. You can create individual cases with attributes, or in this case, you can create word clouds or network relationship graphs. But the problem is it's kind of complex and proprietary. You can't really export it out of the ecosystem. So the central problem is Word and PDF are basically a visual reference. Highlights don't mean anything for the search, but something like NVivo can be complicated, is a closed system, and proprietary. Plus, I had licensing issues as I try to log back into my older NVivo analysis, which you have to make sure you're up to date with the university. So what's the solution? TEI XML, and it's which is an open source standard for text encoding, and Oxygen XML, which is a software platform for encoding analysis. So for those who don't know, I know this might be a touch boring, TEI XML, what is it? XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. It's very reminiscent of and could be considered a superset of HTML, which is the basis for web content. So think of XML as HTML for any kind of document. It's noteworthy that Microsoft Word documents are technically XML. TEI is an XML schema or standard for representing text, frequently historical sources, in digital form. It's been particularly adopted by the humanities as their go-to, and since it's a standard, it allows XML documents and TEI to be understood across different genres by the same digital processors. Because XML is a core language to the web, there's also been programming languages that have been designed to work around it. For example, XSLT to restructure XML documents, and XQuery, which allows one to ask for specific information from those documents. So going from that open source standard, rather than something proprietary, you work with Oxygen XML, which is the main software that is used for encoding. So what is it? It's a standard software for encoding in XML, but it provides a lot of features like auto-completion and live validation. It's paid, but a lot of universities have institutional license, and it's not prohibitively expensive either. It's usually $115 for a one-time cost, whereas in Vivo, even if you're a student, you have to pay $99 a year. But most people work, the benefit of Oxygen XML that I don't think most people explore, which I want to show, is that you can work within something called author mode, which enables you to have more flexibility in what you see is what you get editing, because most of the time people who work with Oxygen work in the encoding mode. So what does this mean? It enables you to do all these 5 things I sort of list just as a basic start of the things that you can do within this integrated environment. So I'm just gonna exit out of this just to show you some of the things that can be done as part of the XML. So this on this side is basically the author mode. The original text document is this. So obviously it looks kind of complex, it has various tags in it, but what happens is because XML can be structured by CSS, you can actually tell it what to look like. So in essence, you can kind of create a way for it to mimic a lot of what one might already do in Microsoft Word or PDF highlighting, except now you get the benefit of matching. You can generate unique identifiers, which are akin to cases, and you can attach attributes to them so that now you can have more identifying information. You could have, and because you're within this environment, you can have something like complex, regular expression searches, so because as as we all know, a perpetual problem of Latin is, you can have many inflected forms. So now you can, need to delete the G here. You can pull up, multiple inflected forms within the document. And then, from there, you can have more complex searches depending upon your knowledge of regular expressions, which is a common programming sort of search tool for text. In addition, because you can structure within author mode how the CSS looks, you can do things like hide entire sections. So it's like, right now we have the bilingual Latin and the Greek. You restructure within the CMS and then suddenly, within the CSS, and now you hide all the Latin sections. So you're just working with the English. Just go on back here. And then this comes back up. And you can also use, as mentioned, you can also use a CS to highlight the particular colors, but also one thing I've done is I've also created this thing called a milestone element. This is kind of a technical detail, but it flattens it so that I can actually use the highlighting here to simultaneously see the same sentences of Latin and Greek Latin and English within the text. So, and in addition, you can also use this you can also use existing programming languages to do things like extract information. So there you go. So this is X query, and I'm just doing this to extract basic information from it. So we have the core. Whoops, I just can't see where this is. So we have the core document here, and then we have an X query that I've written to pull the number of sentences on each one of the passages, and then you can basically export it out. And so this is something that you can cut and paste into an Excel document for further analysis. So that's just an aspect of all the things you can do within one system. So going back to the slide here. So there's certain limitations to this, in that, the grunt work is still quite intensive in terms of encoding primary source text and learning how to work with the CSS and some basic programming. Some features can be automated, but that's done through learning how to program. And automation isn't everything. But the benefit is, you kind of get some job skills from it, because the relatively basic skills needed to work within Extended XML leads you to know how to work with CSS for web design or Xcode, XSLT for programming skills. So that's exactly what the benefit of this is. There's multiple two birds with one stone here. In one case, it's the software itself for encoding analysis, but it's also the tools you need to learn in order to work with it that enable you to benefit your academic and non-academic career. So returning to my own sources, this is an example of the kind of information I'm able to pull from the encoded text within Auction XML. It's an illustration graphed in Excel of the differences of rhetorical imagery within the topic of tax remissions for, Western, late Roman and Visigothic, Ostrogothic, and Eastern laws. Now, all this can be done without an integrated environment. You don't even need Auction XML theoretically. You could just do this with a web browser and spec sources, but that requires more technical knowledge. But as with all bulk knowledge, being able to save one extra step at a time, which in our case is integrating encoding and analysis in one platform, while taking thousands of steps, really only helps to accomplish one's research faster. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Zhishang. And so I also want to point out there was a little bit of confusion because the chat that we as the presenters and presiders have is separate from those of you who are just viewing the presentation. So if you go under the Q&A section, under answered questions, you should be able to get a link to the schedule that I sent to William Campbell. If you're not able to see that or you can't find it, just let us know and we'll try and get another workaround. But yeah, so if you're not able to access the schedule through the chat because it's not visible to you, go through check in the Q&A and see if you can see the link under the answered questions. All right, and now we will move on to our second presenter. So up next, we have Elias Petro. He serves as an assistant professor and librarian of classical, medieval, and modern Greek studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's a historian and paleographer focusing on digital humanities and literature in the late medieval and pre-modern periods. Prior to his recent appointment in Illinois, he was a research associate specialist at the digital project Thesaurus Linguae Graecae at the University of California, Irvine. So take it away, Elias.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an honor to present such a very interesting topic and an interesting project, actually, and you will see what I mean. Hopefully you can see my screen. Sharing with you. Let me see, so it works, okay? Good. So today I'm going to show you and present to you our digital project, which I work for since 2017, focused on the digitization of medieval Greek literature, among others. It starts from the classical times until the pre-modern period. And I'm referring to the project Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, well known as TLG, and based at the University of California, Irvine. And the TLG is a digital online database which aims to digitize and include every Greek text from the classical times to the pre-modern era, as we have mentioned, providing to its users a helpful tool to locate, examine, and use them in various ways. So allow me to show you how it started, because it's very fascinating. We're talking about a digital project that started half a century ago, digital project. In 1971, the PhD candidate at the University of California and later professor of the University of San Diego, Marianne MacDonald, was completing her thesis on Euripides, searching for terms of happiness in his tragedies. Marianne thought it would be much easier if a complete classical language dictionary was available, especially in digital form. After completing her thesis, Marianne donated $1 million to the University of California, Irvine, to prepare a digital dictionary of the Greek language. The project was officially established on October 30th, 1972, the date of the first TLG planning conference. However, the suggestions and work of a young scholar changed not only the purpose of the project, but provided numerous new possibilities for it and formed it as we know it today. His name is David Packard. I am pretty sure that most of you know David Packard, although you think that you do not. You probably know the information and technology company, HP, famous for its computers, printers, hardware, and software. Well, David Packard is the P in the HP logo. When the TLG opportunity appeared, Packard had a new and fascinating idea: to teach a computer how to read Greek and extract any information we need. The advantages of this new plan were numerous. The computer could create the desired dictionary in no time, and the text would be searchable, able to be translated, and organized according to their authors, editions, etc. For these practical reasons, Packard created the EBIGU system, a digital teaching method for a computer to read Greek based on beta code. The huge Ibigus was stored and constantly used in the air conditioning basement of the classics department before it was moved to the baby Ibigus, his tiny brother, which I had the opportunity to have outside my office all the time. Unfortunately, it doesn't work anymore. The project structure actually was simple, based on a prime database, well known as the canon. Canon is the center of the project and the list of the various authors identified with a unique 4-digit number. For example, 0001 is Apollonius Rhodius and 4201 is Johannes Hortasvenus. And under each of these authors, as you can see on the left upper corner of this list, you see is a 4-digit number. You can see the name of the author, and below that you can see the works as these have been added in the Ibicus system, and it becomes 001, 002, so on, so on. Now, each one of these works must go through the Ibicus system, and every Greek letter should be replaced with a Latin symbol readable by our computers, since our computers cannot understand Greek. So each Greek letter, accent, and breathing corresponds to a Latin letter and symbol. For example, smooth breathings corresponds to a left rounded bracket, rough breathing to a right rounded bracket, circumflex to the equal sign, etc. So the phrase "Thesauros της ελληνικής γλώσσας," Thesaurus lingua greca, will be in beta code as such, as you see in your screen. By adding rules and guidelines to the system, the computer can learn when smooth or rough breathing, for example, is right or wrong, when an accent or an acute should be added, when a circumflex is needed, and can provide us with solutions. So actually can read and understand ancient Greek. The structure of the project was ready, and digitization of the text was possible. However, at the end of the 70s, accessibility was an issue. How would the users be able to use the database? Initially, the only access was through specific terminals inside the campus at California. However, the graduate student at that time and professor of classics now at Duke University, William Johnson, along with Packard, heard about a new technology by a small company in South Korea. The technology was called CD-ROM, and the small company is now well known as Samsung. TLG contacted Samsung, and the first CD-ROMs came to Irvine, where they received the digitized Greek classical text and sent them to various users around the globe. Until then, the CDs were used only for music. TLG project was the first to change that. During the next 2 decades, 2 more versions of the TLG CD-ROM were prepared with more authors and works. However, size and space were always an issue. In 1996, the professor of classics, Maria Pantelia, became the project's new director, bringing new ideas and solutions to the table. 2 major decisions for the project were determined. First, the chronological borders of the text were going to expand to the medieval era, including all the Byzantine literature, starting from the various scholia of the Byzantine authors to the classical works. The second was a solution to the space and size of the CD-ROMs. That was internet. By 1999, Professor Pantelia and some brilliant IT engineers prepared and launched the first online version of TLG, our database, providing access to all our patrons worldwide anytime. So now, what are the steps of digitizing the texts? The entire process takes approximately 3 to 4 months, and although during COVID, it was delayed up to 6 months, I have to say. It consists of 3 parts. The first and the third parts take place at our headquarters in California. Only the second part takes place overseas, and specifically in China. During the first part, and after acquiring the text, I prepare its digital bibliography, through which our database, such as the canon, will recognize it and prepare its format in the way you, the users, will see it at the end. The 4-digit number will be appointed, and the bibliography will appear different if it's a monograph, an article in a journal, an article in a book, etc. The next step is to prepare a physical Xerox copy of the edition of the text only, which will be manually transformed into beta code. On that Xerox copy, I provide guidelines on how digitization will take place through marking and color coding the copy, indicating the symbols, the citation, and the formation of the text in general. That leads to the second part of the process, the shipment to our colleagues in China. The specific copy, along with the other copies of the same shipment, will be sent to China, where a company of well-trained typewriters will rewrite every single word of the Xerox copy into beta code, so our computers will be able to read it. This part takes approximately 1.5 months, and every step is monitored through online systems and constant communication. By the end of this part, the physical Xerox copies are returned to California, while their digital version of beta code is sent to our offices. A thorough correction for any oversights by our Chinese colleagues and the original edition, along with minor editing, follows. The text correction is a series of layers of software, each focused on locating and correcting a different part. However, I want to emphasize that nothing happens automatically. Every layer needs to be approved by a researcher of the project. The first main program is called Argo, deriving from the mythical giant with the 100 eyes and the protector of Io, Zeus' mistress. Argo sees everything and constantly provides reports. For example, a bracket has not closed at a specific chapter at a specific line. The numbering of the lines is disturbed at that place. The number of the pages is wrong. There is an extra space between these two words, etc. Only when everything is clear, we continue to the next step, the second main program called IO. IO checks the text word by word, reading and examining them slowly and thoroughly. If she says something not only wrong, but even different, we'll stop and provide you with possible reasons why she stopped and possible suggestions to fix it. It is up to me to examine the text and proceed to relevant changes and corrections, or even ignore them and allow IO to continue. Correcting text with IO takes days, even weeks, and the changes sometimes are thousands. By completing the third and final stage of the digitization, the works have already received their final form and are almost ready to be uploaded. The final report will be prepared, mentioning the changes that took place, the new works, the dates of the corrections, the people who made them, and all the information in general for the work. Everything is kept in a separate log and saved in physical and digital form. Thus, we always know who did what on which text, and we can retract our steps anytime if this is necessary. At the time of the final upload, we take down the entire database and we re-upload everything from scratch with the additions of the new texts. In that way, we add new text and make corrections and changes to already added texts. As you have already observed, the digitization and addition of text to the TLG database are not an easy process at all. Every single work you are scrolling and using every time has been thoroughly detailed, checked from many scholars who try to correct everything and provide you with the cleanest version. Nevertheless, many mistakes are still to be found with TLG. New texts are uploaded every 3 and 4 months, even during the pandemic. We had to come up with new techniques and plans to keep the project running. As we speak, the project includes 10,510 works of 122,099,985 words, with the most common, the word Lego, in 36,753 instances, showing that Greeks love to talk a lot, Lego. Through this paper, through this presentation, actually, I tried to present as briefly as possible a vital digital tool in medieval Greek studies. Its essential task is to serve as a compass and map for every researcher working with medieval Greek literature to provide answers and assistance, ultimately leading to the correct book and the correct edition. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elias. All right, and our third final presenter for this session is James Bailey. James is a historian of the Caucasus and a specialist on handling digital person data, completing his PhD at the University of Vienna, Austria, and is working at the Austrian Academy of Sciences Iranian Studies Department, as well as his core work, which is focused on the people and society of high medieval Georgia. His other academic interests include the representation of history in digital game mechanics and the use of creative methods, including gaming and traditional storytelling when communicating history.
Thank you. Right, just hope that the screen share still works like it did earlier. And I believe we're in the right place there. Okay, good. Yeah, welcome to the prosopography of High Medieval Georgia database. I'm just sort of beaming you the current hacked together testing version live, as it were. But to start with, I wanted to talk a bit about historical person data generally. I won't go kind of right into the deep depths of how this field of study emerged, partly because it's a very long story and partly because I don't want any classicists listening to feel too smug when I point out that they got there first. But instead, I will start by talking about digital person data collections and what what they're trying to do, because this is something that's diversified a lot in recent years, and it's something which I think is possibly one of the most widely important takeaways from what I'm going to say today, because whether or not you're ever going to make a collection of digital person data, it's very important when you look at any of these databases that are increasingly accessible online. So there's the prosopographies of the Byzantine world, of early medieval England, of medieval Scotland, and so on. It's important to know what kind of database you're looking at. And there's an important core division here. So the classic databases, like most of the ones I just mentioned, are built along this kind of factoid model. And what this is kind of there to do is index texts according to the person data. So you have this central element, the factoid, which you can see hopefully in the middle of the graph here. And a factoid is an assertion that a text says something about a person or an event. And this basically means that you can then work back very easily to all the things where a text references a person. It's a very good indexing system, but it has certain issues when historians want to try and use it for things. In particular, because it is a database of what texts say about people, it doesn't end up being a database of what texts don't say about people, and it doesn't end up being a database of what texts imply about people. And those are all things that we're very connected to as historians. Those are things that we actually want to know, particularly if this isn't completely our core area of research. So the index database has a huge number of uses, particularly when you're actively working on an area. But there's also a lot of scope for building databases like the prosopography of High Medieval Georgia, where you've got this sort of, in some ways simpler, in some ways more complex model, which I call the person prosopon system. I can go into why in questions. And the idea of this is essentially it's not a database of what the texts say about people. It's a database of what I am saying about the history based on the texts. It's much more akin to a database version of a traditional bit of secondary source material, such as you might read from any historian. And so this kind of more interpretative data set is important not to get confused with an indexing data set, because the logic behind this is fundamentally different. And I will now show you some bits of what this looks like over and under the bonnet, which will hopefully bring out a few of those points. So this is one of my record entry systems. This is for Ivan Makhagadze, a very prominent 12th century Georgian general. So you can see that there's quite a lot of a notes section here, and that's very important in this model, because essentially I am arguing through the notes section why I have produced these sets of links and this set of structured data that you see in these sections below, with the parents, the children, locations that this person is linked to, and so on. But because I've done that, because I've essentially created, rather than just a set of blocks to do with a text, I've created a more holistic model of my view of the period, it then allows me to start using that for testing things and using that in ways that are going to be more familiar to historians. So, and that I did not load that thing right. We'll come back to this in a second. So, for example, it's quite easy to scroll through the list of persons. If this record loads, then you get a much more kind of familiar to a historian view of, okay, who is this person? What do the sources say about them? Whereas in, for example, the prosopography of the Byzantine world, you could have conflicting bits of information which just sit there neutrally because that's what the system's designed to do. Whereas in this system, if something doesn't make sense, I have to come up with a some sort of synthesis of it, as we would do as a historian. We have several different death dates, for example, for Queen Tamar, who's one of the rulers I work on. In index prosopography, that's fine. It says these things in the sources, they're assertions, it's just there. Whereas in my data set, I have to deal with the fact that people cannot in fact die 3 times. And these two things can look kind of superficially similar. They're both collections of things we're saying about people, but understanding that underlying logic is really important to know what you're dealing with. From these, we can also do things like mapping. Again, this doesn't make sense to do with a factoid model because people in a factoid system could be in multiple places at the same time if different sources disagree. Whereas this synthesized model, you can start looking at this sort of thing and trying to say, okay, if I think this, what are the implications of what I think? What happens when we map out those ideas? So here, what we have, for example, is the red icons are Queen Tamar's second husband, David Soslan. The blue icons are her first husband, Yuri Bogolyubsky, and the yellow icons are the previously mentioned Ivan Makhagadzeeli, this Georgian Armenian general. And you can actually start saying some quite interesting things here, particularly the way that the region that is now Armenia has this much more strong cluster of yellow icons. Essentially, the implication here being Ivan Makhagadzeeli is doing a lot more in the regions that are, ethnically similar to his own family background, whereas he's much less present if you look at the areas towards the east or the southwest, the sort of other major fronts of Georgia's conflict in this period. And there's various other systems available here. So, for example, CSV export, so you can get this data just downloadable into a spreadsheet, essentially. Searches, which I thought I pulled up and apparently didn't. Searches are also, of course, vitally important. And again, these kind of categorization issues can be a very important difference between your index and your kind of developed model, because it will not be a surprise to most of you that if I look at a bunch of Georgian sources from the 12th century, it's really rare for them to explicitly say that anyone is a Georgian. That's the assumed default. So it doesn't get into an index because nobody's saying it. But it's a core part of what we assume is the case about these people. So again, being able to know what sets of assumptions are being made can be quite important here. So, for example, here we can pull out all the people who are tagged as both Georgian and Armenian, at which point we, of course, find Ivan Makhagadzeeli again, and I think about half of these people are related to him. It's quite a small number of people in total. I think the final thing to note is also in terms of testing assumptions. Here's the list of events in the data set, and you'll notice I've got all these numbers in the middle, and what those are calculated date sets, because if I've put in a set of initial assumptions about what happened when, or what the differences of time between two events were, I can then calculate what other things that implies through the rest of the data set by essentially running longest path algorithms across the data. So again, this is a system for building and then testing sets of historical assumptions, which hopefully will be accessible to the public in the next year or two, and will hopefully provide a basis for more exploration of this period. And I think that's me wrapped up. And yeah, I'm very keen to have any questions people might want to ask.
All right, thank you so much to all three of our presenters. I will clap for them and we can all clap on our own sides too. It's wonderful. So for those of you who are just watching this, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom to put any questions that you have into the chat, and then we'll read them off. Our presenters will answer them. For those of us who are presiding or presenting later, you can go ahead and raise a hand and we'll call on you and you can ask your question in person, or you can use the Q&A too if you don't really want attention drawn to yourself, which one would mind. And then of course, our presenters are welcome to jump in at any time, add to people's responses, ask questions of each other, things like that. So it looks we will wait. It looks like we don't have anything in the Q&A quite yet. So do go ahead and drop your questions in there. But I will go ahead and we do, Zhishang, yeah.
First off, it seems just want a technical note. I guess hosts can't ask questions in the Q&A unless I'm pressing the button wrong or something, or we just raise our hands, I guess, or something. Do you know by any chance, or?
I do not know.
Okay.
Check
yeah,
again now. I'm sorry. I think I just there was a setting that was disabled. You should have that capability now.
Okay. I just see under open dismissed. Maybe I'll look at this a little bit later. But I actually had a question for James Bailey. If I'll just go ahead and ask since I'm already here. Can I ask, I guess, what kind of database software are you using to organize your prosperity? Because like one of the reasons why I use XML is because it came out of a need to be flexible with the database structures when the relationships weren't exactly fleshed out. Because if you're using something like SQL or Access, it will really punish you when you mess with the relationship structure. So I'm just curious, like what I guess what the database it is that's backing your prosopography.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer is it's a Neo4j graph database for pretty much those reasons. Yeah, using a kind of graph system, people, events, etc., are all stored as nodes. As much data as possible is just stored as connections. So even, for example, something like somebody having an identity label of, male, Turk, female, whatever, all of those things are stored as links between nodes, which I think gives me quite a lot of flexibility and ability to, switch things around where needed.
What was the data format again?
It's a graph database called Neo4j, NEO4j is the system. And that's got its own query language, Cypher, which is specifically built around graph queries, and being able to do things where you're, kind of jumping between nodes, as it were, in a graph system.
Thank you.
All right, so I did have a question for Zhishang because I've done a little bit of XML coding in Oxygen, but very little, and I was taught it in a manuscript class actually. So we were like coding Scandinavian manuscripts. Do you have any recommendations for anyone who might be listening and want to start that? Of like, are there any good resources for getting into XML? Because I know, like, if I hadn't had someone who already knew it walking me through it, I would have been completely lost.
Yeah, like well, the short answer is the TIC.org website, which is how a lot of people get started. But it's kind of funny. The thing I always want to caution people with is this is one thing I've learned, like, because I'm a failed comp sci background, I at least kind of know what can be done, even if I don't know how to do it. And I think the problem with a lot of people with TI is they get into an encoding mode and then they don't do anything with it, because all encoding is, and at its core is, we're just marking up the data to indicate its structure. So if you have a manuscript, it's like, okay, hey, this one, this letter's in cursive, this section's in Latin. That's all you're doing, you're just describing the data. But if you want to do anything with it, that's a separate process. So if you're talking about just basic encoding, the ti-c.org website is actually a good start, because it'll tell you sort of like the basics of like how to describe what you have. So like, depending upon what your document is, it could be music, it could be poetry, it could be history. TIC just describes TI just is a format for describing. Now, what to do with it, I have a really strong recommendation for a book that came out recently. Like, I can't recommend it enough. It's called, and I'll just I'll cut and paste the title somewhere. It's called X Query for Humanists. And I simply can't recommend this enough because it breaks down like how to ask questions of your encoded source. So like for me, I've indicated, hey, this word is this word has a higher emotional rhetoric than this one, or like this one, or this here's a location, here are dates. And what happens is this book, X Query for Humanists, allows you to work with your TI coding once you have it encoded. So you can do something with it. Because I think the fault of a lot of entrants to TI is they spend all their time describing, but at the end of the day, you have to do something with your data. And so what this book, X Query for Humanists, is lets you do something with it. And I also mentioned it's not too difficult, but if you learn how to work with the programming language X Query, you got to jump ahead and being able to program something else like Python or JavaScript. So, I mean, they're not quite the same, they're different styles of languages, but at least you know the basics of how to work within them. So I would say between that and TEI-C.org. So, but as for the ad hoc nature, I've talked to a lot of other TI experts. It is ad hoc for a reason. They don't want to over standardize it because they want you to be able to do whatever you want with it. But unfortunately, that freedom can also be paralyzing because then you don't know what to do with it. So I acknowledge both its problems and its opportunity, but I can't recommend this book enough for you to do something with it once you decide what you do with it.
Great, thank you. So we do have a question in the Q&A here, but I also wanted to follow up with you just for someone who's coming out of like a comp sci background of some kind, and now is in the humanities. Do you feel like there is a lack of, I don't know, quantitative research methods training for humanists who are trying to get into digital humanities work? Because I always wonder about that, or like even just like statistical work and things like that. As someone who's been like, I was English literature all the way along, so no one's ever taught me how do I use statistics to do anything.
I'm actually the opposite. I originally came from a quantitative side, and now I'm like almost full qualitative because a lot of quantitative people don't acknowledge the essentially what's known as the black box problem. Like we've got this algorithm that maps your literature and now it comes up with a solution. It doesn't. It's still dependent upon the human interaction. I do think there's a basic literacy issue, but if I could have my way, and I've mentioned this within my own department before, I would like to see a trade-off where you can exchange a year or two of primary source languages for computing languages, because some of it is about the basic literacy. There's a syntax and a grammar to computing as there is with our primary source languages. And if they can be traded, they can kind of be supplemented. But as for quantitative training, for every hammer, there's a nail. If you get trained in quantitative, you see everything as quantitative, but we're textual scholars for a reason. We understand the ambiguity. So I myself haven't gone more quantitative. I've only gotten more qualitative.
I mean, could I jump in on that quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I see the questions in the Q&As, so please keep them coming. We will get to them.
I mean, we have a digital humanities master's program here in Vienna now. And I think that's important because I think that one thing is sometimes sort of digital humanities and quantitative humanities kind of get conflated, and I'm not sure they do need to be fully conflated. I think there's an awful lot of digital work that is important without necessarily relying on its quantitative nature. And part of that is about understanding some of the kinds of things I was talking about, where data structures and code and the ways you're looking at things through a computer, understanding how that affects what you're looking at, and particularly understanding that because something is done with some algorithms or some quantitative methods or whatever, doesn't give it some kind of special neutrality or anything like that. One of the things I'm interested in across my work is the extent to which computer code ends up making arguments and encoding arguments about the past. And I think that's one of the things where digital humanities training in and of itself, like as opposed to one or the other, specifically digital humanities training is really important to understand that kind of basis.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we will turn to questions out of the Q&A now. So the first one we have is from Jonathan Correa. who writes, "Thank you all for the presentations. I had a question for all the panelists. I appreciate the attention all three presenters have paid to illustrating the analytical potential of these programs and databases. When we use these tools, we engage differently with the evidence at our disposal. So what are some discoveries you have made thanks to the affordances that these tools provide that you might not have noticed otherwise?" And any one of you can jump in. We'll make sure we'll hit all three. Or I'll call on someone. All right, let's hear from Elias since we haven't heard from you yet.
Thank you so much, guys. That's a very interesting part about the project I was working, the TLG. You have to think TLG as the Google search engine of Greek texts, meaning that, can you imagine being in a monastery in Mount Athos or in Middle East, in Sinai or somewhere, and you just find a fragment of a manuscript, just a small page of a small folio, and you have just only 5 words and nothing else. How can you identify which text and which possible text can be, and which author composed that? So the ability that the TLG can provide this is just by adding 1 or 2 words, or even just a fragment of 1 word, and we show you all the possible results. So it can make your life easier. You can, of course, you can search it manually and go forever. However, if you go quickly through there, just putting the few letters and putting the dots, the letters you cannot read, they show you all the possibilities, and from that you can make the connection. You can continue and do the possibography. You want to identify the author, the scribe, etc. So it's actually it's not showing you something new. It's making something faster, and I think that's a goal of digital humanities. It takes time to work with medieval studies, and especially with medieval literature. And when you are doing with text, digital humanities can make our life easier, and that's why we are here.
Thanks. James, if you have something to add.
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of it is, I mentioned during the presentation, for example, the way you can kind of show people's activity based on the kind of data enrichment. Actually, the single thing that takes the longest when I'm putting my data set together is geolocating places. Just going from your kind of modern translation of an Armenian text to a modern map where half the places are now in Turkey and have names in Turkish is there's some interesting unraveling to be done there. But I would say when I went into this, I was expecting more of it to be that kind of mapping end of stuff. And actually, the biggest area which has been really, really enlightening to me has actually been based on putting the data together in the first place, because that process of structuring the data person by person challenges you as to what you think is true about someone. Because I'm going through for each of a few hundred individuals in my case, and I'm sitting down and I'm saying, okay, well, this person is Georgian or whatever. Why do I think that? What's the actual basis for that little fragment of information about that person? And I think doing that a ton of times really builds up your understanding of what you can justify and why you are thinking certain things about people in the past. Where are you actually mostly just using onomastics and features their names? What is an assumption based on what text somebody appears in? So yeah, I think that there's a lot of power in that kind of structured data methodology for challenging your own ideas. And for some of my ideas about kind of ethnicity and gender and so on in the Caucasus in this period, that's been extremely helpful for thinking through how we look at the period.
Interesting. Thank you. And then Jashan, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think the best thing that I'm able to do with the tools that I have is basically to see what you already feel. And I say this because, I'm working on emotionality. You read through some of these documents and you know what you feel. You feel like, oh, there's a lot of shouting here, or hey, this guy doesn't care at all, he's calm. But what happens is by being able to sort of quantify, digitize, you're able to concretely see, okay, there's a giant spike in instances that you felt was there, but that you couldn't see was there. So if I could say, more than anything, enables you to see what you feel. But that's also why I'm in favor of sort of mixed methods, qualitative approach. The numbers are not a replacement for, the gut analysis, but they support that sort of gut qualitative reading.
Right, great. So the next question coming up in the Q&A is sort of a follow-up to that, and it's directed to Zhishang. What are your plans for displaying your encoded texts and conclusions? For someone who doesn't have a comp sci background, is there an easy way to transfer the XML information into a beautiful display that is approachable?
Oh man, this was the bane of my existence within the first year of learning TI. It's like, wait, what do I do with this? That's actually the purpose of the presentation, by stressing this notion of author mode, which is often not mentioned. Author mode is basically was designed because some companies use Oxygen XML as their Microsoft Word document. So they're able to change, they're able to make things bold or highlight or change. Author mode can be powered by the CSS style sheets that convert HTML into something pretty. So what happens is, if you have a body of XML, how do you make it look pretty? Well, that's where you learn CSS and you learn how to style that into something that you can look at and be useful. And the nice thing about Oxygen XML is there's a built-in program for that, so that you never have to leave that ecosystem, which is the core of what I was saying. Is this look into that mode? I think it's underutilized within the TI community, or because here's the thing, I know people who are real experts at TI, they don't need author mode. They're in the matrix. They just see code and they can just read the code. Some of us are a little more visually oriented. So for that, I recommend looking at author mode. But as for me, eventually, what am I going to do with it? I'm probably going to attach it as a giant appendix to my dissertation, because one of the problems of digital archiving is if you store it on a website, websites go down. And so if you can somehow piggyback it off of, your university library, maybe it might stick around a little longer. So yeah, it'll eventually be attached open source to my dissertation when, if it finishes.
All right, and then we have a question for James from Nicholas Rogers. Are there any resources you'd recommend for someone with very little background in prosopography looking to integrate it into their work?
Yes, although I don't think there is the single book you must read, unfortunately. I mean, it sort of depends exactly what sort of prosopographical work you want to use. There are probably a few core papers. I mean, certainly for anybody who's here and listening to this, I'm very happy to be emailed, and I'm, provide people with a stack of papers as a starting point. I mean, the factoid model stuff is mostly written by John Bradley. A year or so ago, I had a paper in the International Journal of Humanities and Arts Computing, which details my own model in more depth. But yeah, I will. If I put my email in the chat, then hopefully somebody can relay it into the main chat. And I think partly because I genuinely think that can sometimes be one of the most useful ways into this is there's a whole bunch of stuff which anybody who does this will have done, and there is a whole bunch of stuff which is actually much harder to get when you're trying to read it from a fairly abstracted paper, and much easier to get when you just have someone there you can ask the questions to. I find prosopography is quite a practical discipline in that sense. So yeah, I will stick a couple of name recommendations and details to get in touch if that would be helpful to anyone. Oh, I can apparently now send chats to everyone. Very useful.
Oh, good. All right, so I also had a question for all three of our presenters. One of the differences that stood out to me is some of you are working very individually, and then others, so like Zhishang and James, are sort of working on their own specific digital projects, but then Elias is working in a much bigger project that has a lot more, it has more bulk to it, has a lot of people working on it. And so I was just wondering if you could go around and share just a little bit sort of what that experience has been like, what it's like to work on an individual digital project versus working on a group, sort of like just, professionally, academically, anything like that?
If I can start, I want to say this can sound weird. The ultimate vibe for me working alone has been one of paranoia. And I say this because I constantly don't know whether I'm reinventing the wheel or not. I do my best to reach out to fellow TI experts, and they're able to keep me in the loop. But when you're not part of a broader team, there's always this lingering anxiety, which is true for all grad students. Let's be honest. There's always this lingering paranoia that you just like an example is I spent a long time programming a system for validating my elements against each other in Latin and Greek. And then I talked to one of the professors like, oh, that can be done in schematron. I'm like, ah. So for me, the only one problem of working alone is you're never quite sure if you're if you're reinventing the wheel. And the only solution is you gotta reach out yourself.
Shall we go to the bigger project or shall we go to James? What do you prefer?
Yeah, well, I think James was doing some chat stuff, so I was going to let him go sort of after that. So yeah, let's jump to Elias.
Okay, so collaborating with my other colleagues, I think it's safer. Why do I say safer? Because we have a safety net, logs, and everything is happening for a purpose, and by taking the responsibility and working alone, it's amazing. It's working. You have to deal with all these new exciting discoveries, but at the same time can be tedious, frustrating, and you can miss something and you don't have someone to catch you. In my project, I have to be honest that imagine just a working line of car industry. So everyone has a position until the end, a final product. The thing is that what I like about collaborating with my colleagues is that when we have, for example, coming the text back from China, we're correcting it. I described the process briefly during my presentation. I didn't mention, however, due to the lack of time, that this is happening twice. I am the primer, for example, investigator and examiner, which is going to do the edits, but at the same time, after I finish the editing, is going to the second researcher who's going to do exactly the same thing, and is going to compare the mistakes which I found with his or with hers, and we see that actually, okay, you missed this or I missed that, and at the end we have merged them all together, so you have a much more, let's say, clear product. We are trying to minimize the mistake, and we don't trust computers. It's a very weird thing saying about digital humanities projects, but that's why actually for example, we had to close this. We had we chose our Chinese colleagues from a competition with Koreans, Greeks, and Italians, and we chose them for that on collaborating with them not because everyone will say probably it's cheaper. No, it's not cheaper. It's much more expensive than, for example, sending it to Greece or Italy. The reason is actually because the mistakes they are going to make our colleagues there are going to be more obvious to the computer than a native speaker or a more common Italian, for example, who's going to see Greek and is going to be more familiar to it. So we wanted someone who has no idea about Greeks, and we're going to make, let's say, obvious mistakes that will catch them. So all this chain and collaborating all these different parts to have the final product at the end has a purpose, and it's okay if you miss something. Mistakes are happening. That's why we have these backups, we have these logs, and I'm so thankful. I mean, guys, you are amazing. Yashung and James, you're doing an amazing job and going out in the field, lone wolves and hunting. However, I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel safer. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and James, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a certain kind of, loneliness of producing something like this single-handedly. But there are also kind of interesting aspects of that. And I think the logic of my project, where it's really about encoding my own ideas and arguments as a set of structured data, kind of almost relies on that element of it to work. the way I kind of see it, the sort of phrase I like to use is trying to produce a cycle of virtuous imperfection. I'm going to get some things wrong. There's going to be areas where I've had to use a translation of an Armenian or Persian source because I don't read those languages. And somebody will hopefully then come along and say, actually, that's not right. That translation isn't right. That thing you've done isn't quite right. But if you haven't done that work and gone out and said, okay, I'm sticking my head above the parapet, here is what I think this set of data looks like to begin with, then people don't have the basis to make those arguments, and the whole kind of state doesn't move forward. So I think it is, I mean, yes, I think there are always going to be points where you mess up doing this or any other work in the humanities, but I think those are actually important because it's by knocking things backward and forth with each other in the long term that we can build a stronger understanding of the past.
All right, thanks everyone. So we are at time, although this is going to be the same meeting for the day, so we've technically started our break. We do have one more question in the Q&A from Kevin Roddy, and he just wants to know if any of the participants have heard of the program called Obsidian, which creates semantic webs and has the value of depicting relative distances between a core concept and other related concepts. So anyone? Any thoughts? Okay, so no. So we all learned something today. All right, so we'll hang on to that then. Okay, so we are, like I said, we are at time. We have a 10-minute break before our next session starts. You are free to mute your screens, go off, grab snacks, whatever, for whatever time it might be in your time zone. Yeah, otherwise we will see you guys back here in about 10 minutes. Thanks.